I first met Deaf Bill in 1996. I had just arrived in Alton, Illinois, and I was excited to see this local celebrity. It wasn't easy. Hundreds of people were waiting to say hello. Still, I felt honored to finally meet Deaf Bill.
I'm Brian Fine. I'm a licensed funeral director here at State and Fine Funeral Home in Alton, Illinois. I had always heard that he was a wild man. He enjoyed drinking quite a bit. Had always heard that he would preach on street corners. Would walk into area churches during church services and take over the preaching. He actually lived out on an island, I was told, in the Mississippi River. There was a local businessman, Mr. Bauer, that owned a ferry down on the river, and he apparently got to know Deaf Bill quite well, as Bill would take the ferry across the river. Mr. Bauer also owned a local funeral home here in Alton called Bauer and Hain Funeral Home. And Mr. Bauer took him to what was known as the Alton Poorhouse. And that is where Deaf Bill passed away, was the Alton Poorhouse. No family showed up. The body was taken to the Bauer and Hain Funeral Home, which at that time was located down near the river, and he was embalmed, but not in the normal fashion that we would do embalming today. Mr. Bauer thought they would experiment with a different process where the embalming wasn't done with chemicals like we do today. He more or less dehydrated with this process. I had heard that a circus had approached Mr. Bauer and his business partner, Mr. Hain, and wanted to purchase Bill Lee's body, where it would be exhibited in the circus. The funeral directors declined selling his body to the circus, though. The funeral home in latter years moved from downtown from the riverfront area. Apparently, Mr. Bauer and Mr. Hain built a special closet in one of the side parlors at the funeral home, and Mr. Lee was inside of the closet where he stood many, many years, dressed in basically a loincloth. Thousands of folks I've heard visited Deaf Bill up through the years. Bride and groom were married here in Alton. The groom took his new bride by the funeral home and insisted that his new wife see Deaf Bill standing in the closet. I had heard schools took field trips to the funeral home to show the kids Deaf Bill. Tour buses passing through town unload many passengers just to walk through the funeral home to view Deaf Bill. And I would have been probably 15, 16 years old when I first heard about Deaf Bill. I was working for a local funeral home in Granite City and started to hear these stories about Deaf Bill up in Alton. So it was right after I first received my driver's license. I ventured out one night on a drive up here to Alton, driving past the Burke Funeral Home. Felt a little bit creepy. Number one, me outside looking in through this funeral home windows at 9, 10 o'clock at night on a stormy night. I had just seen pictures of him. I had not seen him personally, but also just visualizing this mummified man inside of a closet, inside of a dark funeral home. So it really sparked my curiosity, and I wanted to learn more about him. And in 1995, I had heard that Mrs. Burke was looking to slow down a bit and sell her funeral home. So I approached Mrs. Burke, and we came to terms, and I purchased her funeral home. I'll never forget the time that I went over to meet her for the first time and walked in through the back door of the funeral home, and I asked her one of the very first things if I could see Deaf Bill, and she gladly took me to the visitation room where he stood in his special closet, and she pulled back this large, tall, white closet door, and there he stood. I was probably amazed mostly by his hair, that he had such fine black hair, much like my own hair, a very well-trimmed mustache, and his body was fully intact. And it just starts going through my mind of all the thousands of people that had seen him, and here I am for the first time finally seeing him. But yet I kind of had a feeling of something wasn't quite right. I felt bad for this gentleman that had stood there in the closet for 80 years, thinking that he was perhaps entitled to a proper burial, just like anyone else that we lose. I had several area ministers come to me along with other folks that lived here in town and said, you know, I know that you're starting the business here or purchasing it. Why don't you give this man a final proper burial? And at that time, I knew that was the right thing to do. Yes, it truly was amazing. Once word got out what we had planned to do, I started to receive phone calls from area businesses that wanted to be part of Deaf Bill's final send-off. Had some folks from the Alton Little Theater that called me and said they had some turn-of-the-century clothing. Had area florists donate flowers. The Knights of Columbus here in Alton offered to serve as pallbearers for the service. Had a call from our local vault company that donated a concrete burial vault. Artco Casket Company donated a dark finished wood casket that would have probably been used back in the day. So it was really nice to see the community and come together and want to be part of this celebration of Bill's life. His visitation was held on a Sunday afternoon and early evening. There was between 300 and 400 folks that filed through. There was a line that extended out the front door of the funeral home down to the sidewalk. Folks waiting to come in to have a last glimpse at Bill.
I first met Deaf Bill in 1996. I had just arrived in Alton, Illinois, and I was excited to see this local celebrity. It wasn't easy. Hundreds of people were waiting to say hello. Still, I felt honored to finally meet Deaf Bill. With me, in line, was an elderly lady. We waited for our turn to file past the casket. She told me that many years before, her husband had taken her to see Deaf Bill on their wedding day. Now it was a half-century later. The bride from 50 years before was standing next to me, elderly and a widow. She said Bill had been such an important part of her wedding day. She had to see Deaf Bill one last time.